Hello, welcome back. Bienvenue. Actually, a few people have asked me what bienvenue means. It means welcome in French, because, Canadian. Now, this video started as something completely different, like Supernatural and Adam Milligan kind of completely different. And somehow I ended up talking about Zelda and its ties to the Meiji. I mean, you figure that one out, because I sure as hell can't. Yes, we're talking about the Legend of Zelda. It is a phenomenon that has swept the entire world, and yes, it is my absolute favorite video game series. Sorry, Resident Evil, you're still number 2. Look, we all know that Nintendo is Japanese, but did you know that the company started out as a small playing card company in the Meiji? I mean, we're talking about 1889, Meiji 22. They manufactured Hanafuda cards, or flower cards, which you gotta admit is a pretty limited market that was already pretty damn saturated. And Nintendo went through all sorts of different business ventures after that, just trying to find what would work for them. See, Hiroshi Yamauchi, the grandson of the owner, he went to the US during the 50s, and the 50s is a time where the US was extremely invested in helping Japan succeed. So of course he came back to Japan with all these new grand ideas, how to revitalize the company. So they tried things like taxi services, or hotels, or trying to sell vacuum cleaners. And they all failed big time. Nintendo was just struggling under a huge amount of debt because they just couldn't stay relevant in the post-war era. But it wasn't until they started manufacturing games and toys that they really found their stride. In 1983, they released Famicom, but only in Japan. And it wasn't exactly the greatest thing ever because it was a problematic console. See, it had these hardware issues where the games would freeze, and that's not exactly fun. So it underwent this major overhaul, and all these bugs were fixed. They actually managed to do that. And so it was repackaged, rebranded, and re-released under a new name. Nintendo Entertainment System. And it went worldwide. I mean, Americans were already intimately familiar with the quality of Japanese products that were flooding the market at this time. Remember back in my Seven Samurai video when I talked about how the US occupied Japan during the post-war? Well, pretty much they were trying to help them get back on their feet. They basically gave them all of the tools to rebuild their industry and economy. And that's when Japan started flooding the market with these cheaper, better-made Japanese electronics and cars and, pretty much everything.
No wonder this circuit failed. It says made in Japan.
What do you mean, Doc? All the best stuff is made in Japan.
Unbelievable.
I remember this one episode of that 70s show, which is very possibly the first one, where Red Foreman is just grumpy and annoyed that he had to buy a Japanese car, but it was just cheaper and it ran better than the American Vista Cruiser that he pawned off on his kid. But I digress. The point is, the NES set a new standard for all future multiplayer consoles. I mean, we still use the basic foundation of a controller no matter the console you use, Xbox, Sega, PlayStation. At this point, you're probably wondering how this all ties in with Zelda, and I'm getting there. Kind of. I mean, I'm not entirely sure my thought process makes sense to anybody, least of all me. But The Legend of Zelda has arguably become one of the most influential video game series in the entire world. And it's all due to the creative vision of Shigeru Miyamoto. Seriously, Zelda became a benchmark for all future games. And the concept, in theory, is simple. A young boy named Link, easily identified by his trademark green tunic, is the chosen hero destined to save the princess, and subsequently bring peace to the entire world. But the game itself is actually anything but simple. See, because unlike Miyamoto's other brainchild, Super Mario Bros., Zelda wasn't a linear game. Players are forced to think and strategize and make decisions about their next course of action. They have to solve puzzles. There was literally nothing else on the market like it, and Nintendo was a bit concerned. But you know what? They didn't have to be, because The Legend of Zelda was this huge smash hit. What I find most fascinating about the Zelda series is that any of the games, any of them at all, can be easily picked out of a lineup as a Japanese-produced game. I mean, even if they're created with an international market in mind. I mean, aspects of the game, of course, have been borrowed from other cultures, like Link pulling the sword out of the stone. I mean, that's definitely King Arthur. And the Gerudos? Well, that's definitely a Middle Eastern influence of culture. But in my opinion, Zelda could only have been created by Japanese, just because of the distinct link to natural beauty and nature, plus all of the little hints of Japanese culture that are sprinkled throughout all of the games. Spirits, foxes, tricksters, temples, shrines, not to mention the sages, are oddly reminiscent of Zen Buddhist monks. For me, Zelda and Nintendo are my childhood. It's my teenage years. It's my adulthood. They have continued to innovate and create fantasy action-adventure with new challenges and puzzles. And let me just say that their creativity isn't solely limited to their consoles and games. Have I ever talked about when the economic bubble burst in Japan? I mean, to this day, Japan has never fully recovered. Overnight, people literally lost their jobs, their homes, the clothes off their back. It was seriously a terrible time. Families committed suicide. Entire villages were deserted. I mean, people literally got up and walked away from their homes. Of course, Nintendo stock plummeted. But unlike a lot of companies, they actually came out on top. Arguably, they could be called the number one company in Japan because they don't have bad loans or debt. And honestly, I kind of attribute this to Nintendo's willingness to take risks. They try to anticipate the wants and the needs of the gamer. I mean, I think it's kind of funny that parents have always been a bit wary and angry about this video game culture. I mean, it kind of started feeding into that whole Japanese panic because the Japanese were stealing their jobs and their ideas. I mean, at the time it was released, Breath of the Wild knocked the American-made Skyrim out of the top spot for the largest playable gamescape for an action RPG. And it only kept growing. Every new console that Nintendo has released has followed this very well documented Japanese ability to dissemble, improve, and then reimagine. We're talking about the Super Nintendo in 1990 and the upgrade to 16-bit, or the addition of the analog wand for the N64 3-prong controllers. That added a whole new level of interacting with Link's surroundings when it came to his new 3D environment. Or the new motion sense technology of Wii, the one that literally let players cut down their enemies or shoot arrows from bows on horseback. Plus there was the upgrade of the motion plus technologies that made for better responsive sword fighting action in Skyward Sword. And what about Breath of the Wild's reactive and expansive open world that's setting a new standard for how games are created? So much of this game is just simply there for the aesthetic, to add to the environment and the feel of the game. Like Lorelin, they've been able to refocus and re-envision what a game is and how we play. This has brought gaming into a whole new realm of social activity. It's kind of like Nintendo's roots in a tiny card company that started in the Meiji. In the face of economic ruin, Japan adapted and created a whole new power. This idea of cool Japan. Japanese culture was being spread throughout the entire world, not just through anime and manga, but also video games. Zelda just carries this level of nostalgia, even in non-gamers. I mean, modern game designers and developers across the entire globe have been inspired by the world of Zelda. And trust me, nostalgia is a hugely powerful motivator when it comes to creativity. It's not possible to walk into a game store and not see Zelda merch. It is a soft power sensation. Link is a international fictional celebrity. At this point, I'm probably supposed to summarize everything for you, tell you the meaning behind this mess of a rant, but honestly, I can't. I just really love the world of Zelda. The characters are compelling, the stories are engaging, the world is breathtaking. Zelda has created a global community for people across the world to connect and build friendships and relationships, and foster creativity in art, music, recreation, books, and even fashion. Everybody wants to be a hero. And Nintendo and Zelda, they're just simply the link between reality and imagination.
Beautiful cat with space. Hot fur with horse.